And if not more, it's over there watching.
Okay, so it just positioned in a way where it's comfortable.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute at the CUNY School of Public Health. Thank you for coming on a hot June day in the sort of peak of the growing season for those of you who are farmers. Happy Pride for those of you celebrating 50 years of LGBTQ activism in New York City. My name is Nevin Cohen, and my name is Nevin Cohen. I'm a professor here, and I'm the research director for the Urban Food Policy Institute. And for those of you who know me, I've been working on this issue of planning and urban agriculture for a long, long time. And I'm really excited that there seems to be some traction in moving forward with an urban agriculture plan for New York City. There was a hearing just a couple of weeks ago in the City Council for Councilmember Espinel and the Brooklyn Borough President's a bill to require an urban agriculture plan. So today's discussion is really about how do we chart the future of urban agriculture in New York. That's the broad theme, but really, what can an urban agriculture plan do and in helping to grow urban agriculture in New York City? We have a really wonderful group of panelists. Their bios are on the sheet of the table to my right. So I won't read their bios, but I just want to mention them briefly. Ray Figueroa, I've known for many, many years, has been extremely active in this realm of urban agriculture for his career. He's previously the director of the New York City Community Gardening Coalition, but he runs a wonderful alternatives to incarceration program at Brook Park Youth Farm. He's a teacher at Pratt Institute, and he's been working as a tireless advocate for urban agriculture in New York City for decades. Aziz Dakan is a born and bred New Yorker and has also been a tireless advocate for urban agriculture in New York City. He's worked for many grassroots organizations in New York City and is now the executive director of the Community Gardening Coalition in New York. Anika Abraham is the director of Farm School in New York City, an institution that has grown and blossomed under her leadership and is a wonderful institution to train young people in both urban agriculture and advocacy. And finally, Ricky Stevens is the director of digital strategy for agritecture consulting and is working with a number of commercial urban agriculture ventures to grow that sector. And so without further ado, I'm going to give a brief introduction, and then each of the panelists will talk for about 8 or 10 minutes, and then we'll have time for back and forth discussion with you. So I'd like to keep this forum integrative and really dynamic, and so I'd like people in the audience to really feel like you're part of the conversation. And this is the beginning of a conversation that I hope will continue and will help to support to move urban agriculture forward in New York City. And I wanted to mention that Just Food is working also to organize people to support and help pass the Urban Agriculture Bill, Intro 1058. And so that's another organization that I hope that you're connected to and involved with. So without further ado, let me begin by posing the question, why bother with an urban agriculture plan? And this is a really important question for us to think through. New York zoning is quite permissive. It allows gardens and farms in almost all parts of the city, right? So, and this is unlike other cities that have restricted food production to specific areas or whose zoning text was ambiguous about urban agriculture, so it was always unclear whether urban farms or gardens could be located in a specific place. So if it's not broken, why bother to fix it? Well, I think for me, the reason for a plan is that zoning is only one element of planning. They're actually not the same thing. They're connected, but they're not the same thing. So zoning divides areas of the city into different zones and parcels by major uses and more specific subcategories. Sometimes it defines the allowable activities in each zone. It may specify the configuration of buildings on parcels, the types of uses allowed. And even the design features in some areas that can maintain a neighborhood's context or prescribe impacts. But planning is something different. So planning informs zoning, and it includes much more than just the spatial configuration of a city. Planning is about establishing goals and objectives for a city and developing strategies for achieving them. So it includes budget issues, it includes spatial configuration issues, it also includes policies that need to be in place to achieve goals. Strategies also may include demographic, environmental, cultural, and political concerns. A plan may identify ways through policies to affect where and how people live and move around the city and the design of the cityscape. And they're based on data and methods from different disciplines. So an urban agriculture plan would involve much more than simply leaving the city's permissive zoning on the books in the expectation or hope that gardeners and farmers will find spaces to grow food. It would involve measuring the existing urban agriculture system, developing goals and objectives for the future of urban agriculture, and really laying out strategies for achieving those goals. So what would that look like in practice? One thing would be to create a census of urban agriculture. We don't have a single place in New York that lists every single farm and garden and the parameters of those spaces and what's growing on those spaces. That would be extremely important in developing a comprehensive plan to grow urban agriculture in New York. Welcome. This is a database that I've actually started to put together, and I'm going to share this out with people in the audience and other advocates to help crowdsource the information. But this is a database of farms and gardens in New York City that I've been collecting. Grow NYC has a list of the gardens that are under their responsibility, but there isn't a comprehensive list that includes other gardens and farms and other commercial projects. What would establishing goals and objectives look like? Well, this is a chart that is in this book, which is now actually just about 7 years old, Five-Borough Farm. I worked on this with colleagues, and this really describes in great detail why we need a plan for urban agriculture and what a plan would include. So if you haven't looked at this, I urge you to take a look at it online. But this metrics framework shows that farms and gardens produce lots of different outcomes: health, social, and ecological and economic benefits, because of all the activities that go on both in the farms and gardens and also in organizations and projects that are related to the farms and gardens. And we need to know what those benefits are and prioritize as a community what the most important ones are and how they can be bolstered through policies and perhaps zoning and other changes to the cityscape. A plan would identify synergies and conflicts, right? This is Via Verde in the Bronx. It's a development that has a farm, a community garden, and an orchard built into it. This is on a parcel that is zoned for residential buildings. It could have been an ordinary, plain old apartment building, right? But it was designed as an integrative urban agriculture project because HPD, the housing department, issued an RFP saying we want a healthy development and developers tell us what you can design, right? So it's the proactive, conscious policy making of the HPD department back then that enabled this to be a development that conceptualized healthy building as a building that includes urban agriculture. Right? The zoning allowed it, but the zoning didn't make this happen, and that's the value of planning. Nothing happens without money in any place in the world, particularly in New York City. So a plan is actually also responsible for identifying the budgets necessary for things to happen. The city puts out a capital strategy for the capital budget. It also puts out a proposed expense budget every year, actually twice a year in draft form and final form. And so planning involves capital planning. But what kind of infrastructure do we need to make urban agriculture grow in New York? Do we need food processing infrastructure? Do we need transportation infrastructure? That needs to be put into a long-term capital plan for it to be built. And so if we're thinking about growing urban agriculture and thinking about all the infrastructure needed, we need to think about the budgets required for urban agriculture. A plan would identify the resource needs for expanding urban agriculture: water, compost, other materials and products that go into farming in the city. And this is a database that Rosita, Ilieta, and I are working on in New York with colleagues in 4 other countries in Europe. It's called the Food, Energy, Water Meter. What we're doing is we've created a cloud-based database to collect data from farms in 5 different cities around the world to understand the resource needs of farms, to measure them, and to understand the relationship between energy, water consumption, food production in farms and gardens. We need that information to understand whether using potable drinking water makes sense for irrigation, or whether the city should invest more in capturing rainwater for irrigation. We don't even know how much the relationship is between irrigation water and food output in the city. So understanding those resource flows and then using life cycle assessment to project what would the resource needs be if we expanded urban agriculture in a city like New York, a city like London or Paris, and what are the costs involved in those resources. It's really critical. Integrating urban agriculture into housing planning. I showed you Via Verde. This is another example of forest houses, and Arbor House in the Bronx, and forest houses, a NYCHA development. There's really no mention of urban agriculture as an integral feature in housing in the city's housing plan. So another important aspect of planning is that it should be comprehensive, or at least plans should conform with each other and reinforce each other. There should be synergies, not conflict. And so this is the age-old conflict between housing and urban agriculture. How can we resolve it in a planning process? We need to resolve it in an urban agriculture plan, but we need to resolve it in our city's housing plan. To what extent is urban agriculture really an important part of designing and developing new housing in New York City? Planning for food production, distribution, education in NYCHA. Well, NYCHA is a city in and of itself. It has, on the books, 400,000 residents, probably more like 500,000 people live in NYCHA developments throughout the city. And there are exciting things going on. This is the Pink Houses farm. I've been working, evaluating the farms at NYCHA project, which is 6 large-scale urban farms in NYCHA developments. NYCHA has had a garden program for decades. We don't know how many farms or gardens are left in that gardening program. There isn't a census of NYCHA farms at this point. And so farming and gardening needs to be incorporated in NYCHA's plans, especially now as it's really thinking about how to catch up on its capital rehabilitation needs and figure out ways to invest in the future in a housing authority that is really financially strapped. Same thing is true about neighborhoods that are being rezoned throughout the city. And there needs to be a way to integrate the goals of an urban agriculture plan with the goals of neighborhood plans. This is a community-based neighborhood plan in East Harlem. One of the issues in East Harlem was a development site that HPD developed for housing that had 4 active gardens on it. And it was a struggle with the community to really maintain those, at least some of those gardens in the design of the new building. It's called Sendero Verde. It was actually the developer is the same developer, John Rose Companies, that developed the Via Verde in the Bronx. It is being designed to include urban agriculture, but those battles don't need to be battles all the time if there's a planning process to say, okay, as we rezone neighborhoods, as neighborhoods develop, this is the amount of urban agriculture we want. These are the farms and gardens that we want to protect in our communities, and we want to protect them because we have the data to show that they produce value for the neighborhood that we've quantified and we can show is worth saving those spaces for food production. Integrating agricultural startups in economic development plans is another thing that an urban agriculture plan can do. This is New York Works, which is a plan by the city to support incubators for small businesses. There's one mention of an agricultural business in New York Works, but it's really not really central to the plan. It could be more front and central because we have a growing sector, both of commercial food production, but also of businesses that are growing products for urban agriculture. And so, again, integrating an urban agriculture plan with an economic development strategy for the city is really a critical need. We have a number of plans that have been developed after Sandy to promote resilience, and climate change resilience is a critical issue for New York, as you know. And we, maybe Aziz will mention this. This is an illustration from the Gardens Rising project in the Lower East Side to reconceptualize the network of gardens in the Lower East Side as a bulwark or a way to prevent flooding during storm events. This needs to be thought through for the entire city, and we need to think about urban agriculture as a way to increase resilience, both by reducing the heat island effect and reducing the health effects of intense heat events in New York City, but also to prevent flooding. And we need to integrate it into our green infrastructure plan. The green infrastructure program has financed rooftop farms, but productive green spaces is not an explicit priority of the green infrastructure plan. But it could be made a priority if that were part of the planning process. And those kinds of productive green spaces, rather than just plain sedum roofs or bioswales, could be made priorities in financing projects in the future. And waste management plans. We have a detailed waste characterization study in the city and a number of waste plans for New York. And the role of urban agriculture as part of the city's waste system could be more explicit and thought through more comprehensively in both an urban agriculture plan and in the city's waste management plans and composting plans. What might that mean? It might mean investing public money in more resources to produce compost and more resources for urban farms and gardens to manage their waste. And we would then be able to quantify what are the benefits of investing in waste composting infrastructure in the city. To what extent can an expanded urban agriculture system support the goals and economic needs of the sanitation department in addressing the management of organic material? And finally, neighborhood health plans. So by showing you these plans, I'm giving you an example of areas, domains in the city that the city has considered really important to plan for, right? Health, solid waste, housing, urban agriculture and food production, and the food system should be another domain, I think, that the city actually affirmatively plans for, right? And doesn't leave simply up to the market with existing zoning to solve for itself, right? Because after all, we have a zoning text that explains where housing can be built. Why do we need a housing plan for New York City? Well, because the housing market needs to be planned. Because in and of itself, it doesn't automatically produce affordable housing in the right places at the right quantity. And so the same thing is true for urban agriculture. I think we need to begin to plan for an expanded urban agriculture system, because even though we've been lucky that it's happened in a robust way all by itself in New York, we have maybe 900 farms and gardens in New York City that are producing food, it's not clear that that system can grow without planning and policy and budgets for infrastructure. And so this one example is the idea that farms and gardens produce health benefits, but they're not incorporated into the Department of Health's every neighborhood, every New Yorker, everyone's health counts, health plan, and it could be. So with that, I'd like to turn to Ray Figueroa to continue this discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming out. Thank you, Nevin. Thank you to my colleagues. Thank you to so many familiar faces in the audience. I'm very grateful to see our community elders out. Makes me particularly happy because I seek your approval when I speak and to make sure that I'm doing things in a proper way. So I just want to acknowledge you and your authority within our community. Thank you for being here. My name is Ray Figueroa. I'm still engaged with New York City Community Garden Coalitions. I'm still president of the board of directors of the New York City Community Garden Coalition, where I do a lot of policy work. So anyway, actually, I must say, Nevin, you covered a lot of what so I'm probably going to run through a bunch of the slides because Nevin, and it'll be quite evident. So comprehensive urban agricultural plan, this is just a shot at Brook Park. But yes, Nevin already spoke to this in a lot of detail. Comprehensive really does require reconciling what heretofore and up to the present are disparate municipal policies and plans. And we're just not going to get very, very far if we are not speaking with each other. If the left hand in the Department of Environmental Protection is not speaking with the right hand, if you will, of the Housing Preservation Development Department, and so forth and so on. And so there are, as Nevin already alluded to, many areas of intersection with the Green Infrastructure Plan. There are also lots of potential for intersection with housing, and Nevin already spoke to that, so let's just run through this. Comprehensive requires decision-making inclusivity of all stakeholder communities. I would say at the heart of that would be a representative, a truly representative group of urban agricultural that make up an urban agricultural task force. We had one in New York City during the previous mayoral administration of Michael Bloomberg, and it was rather very productive, actually. And that emanated out of the 5-Borough Farm Initiative. We got together with city agencies, parks, talked with sanitation folks about how agencies could collaborate and leverage their respective resources in order to move urban agriculture forward. Another wonderful outcome of the Urban Agricultural Task Force is really identifying opportunities for funding and supporting urban agricultural initiatives at the very hyperlocal level. So, yes, public meetings that engage respective stakeholders, local NGOs, residents, institutions, government agencies to be sure, and decentralized venues and times, meaning that planning needs to happen when folks are around. That is to say, in the evenings, on weekends, the Urban Agricultural Task Force needs to visit the South Bronx, needs to visit Harlem, needs to visit Brownsville, Brooklyn, and so forth and so on, and not be in a bubble in centralized somewhere in downtown Manhattan. Very important if we're actually going to incorporate the very richness of perspectives and really incorporate a real accountability in the process of developing this plan. Let's see here. Okay, comprehensive also requires consideration of fundamental racial, economic, and built environmental disparities, as well as basic, best, and promising practices. And what I'm alluding to there is that the history of the way development and planning and zoning has proceeded, not just in New York City, but in municipalities around the country, there have been instruments known as exclusionary zoning, instruments such as redlining, instruments such as urban renewal, benign neglect, planned shrinkage, on, which really were designed to relegate the communities, minority communities, communities of color, in such a way that they were economically marginalized, economically segregated from development opportunities, and this has continuing feedback to this day. So really comprehensive also requires that we reconcile with that history and really put a focus on bringing a measure of justice to bear within the planning process. Very, very, very important. Justice has is a concept that, you know, really suggests that folks are taking initiatives on their own behalf for the purposes of righting wrongs, taking initiatives to work on in such a way that is meaningful and productive for them, that is self-determining, and that really honors their sense of human dignity. That's all the work of justice. This is all, if one were to look at a map of community gardens, say a green thumb map, which is the city department that is under parks that oversees about 600 or so community gardens. They have a map of community gardens. If one were to look at that map, and I'm recommending that you do that, and then look at an urban renewal map, they actually layer each other. And then if one were to look at a redlining map, you see that the layers are really quite consistent, meaning that community gardens, community farms have arisen in areas and have been initiatives on the part of local folks to redress some of these historic marginalization issues. Okay, so here I'm going, wait a minute, let me just go back, and so that I don't, strategies to promote food justice and planning. Okay, some general strategies: prioritize urban agriculture and long range neighborhood service delivery and other planning efforts, and Evan spoke to that. Offer meaningful participation opportunities for food justice organizations, disadvantaged communities. Target funding resources, incentives, and Evan spoke on that, and benefits for food justice organizations and disadvantaged communities. Permanently protect land. So land is a huge issue, so I just want to focus on that. There is, out of the city of Boston, a really comprehensive urban agricultural zoning that was came about in 2013. It's called Article 89. What Boston has since has done in the immediate wake of developing comprehensive urban agricultural plan, Boston has also developed a companion document known as Article 89 Made Easy. And that really is to make this accessible to communities of folk who are not themselves professionals in the planning field, which I think is really a very enlightened approach to developing the infrastructure, if you will, the planning infrastructure, the zoning infrastructure for urban agriculture. City of Seattle, just want to allude to urban agriculture also has come about. Seattle has a number of really exciting things. One of the things that Seattle has done is that local voters got involved in terms of mounting direct ballot initiatives. In other words, we can talk about city planning, we can talk about agencies, we can talk about what electeds are and are not doing with respect to urban agriculture and food justice and social justice in general, and we can do that, but it's also important to see what else we can do that is very, very proactive. And so in a place like Seattle, in a place like Baltimore and Philadelphia, Seattle really did focus on mounting a ballot initiative that was directed specifically at preserving gardens and developing the funding. It was a bond issue that was voted on directly. It was a direct democracy initiative that was able to establish a bond issue to support the purchase of land for community gardens. And so I'm suggesting that as something as not just as a very best practice, if you will, among the best and promising practices, that we need to take ownership of policy making. Okay, did I get everything? Yeah. Seattle also has something really kind of cool. They have developed a social equity toolkit. In every aspect of planning, the municipality of Seattle brings to bear: are we engaging communities? Are we engaging communities that have been marginalized? Are we are we addressing structural issues around land and fiscal finance resources to historically marginalized communities, on and on and on. So there are, a few things there that I would suggest are among the very best practices coming out of Seattle that I think we would do well to consider and adopt. I'm putting this up talking about equity. New York City Planning, Department of City Planning, put a document out in 2015. It has to do with transfer of development rights. And very interesting mechanism. They cite a number of initiatives, there are a number of examples in this document. One of the most, the one that I like to highlight is the theater district. Times Square. Everybody knows Times Square, a bunch of theaters there. Well, those theaters were threatened with disappearing because the owners just couldn't upkeep them. And, the city came up with a plan in concert with the owners, in concert with other players to designate that area of Times Square and the adjacent contiguous area around Times Square as a special purpose district. In this case, a special purpose theater district for the purposes of preserving the theaters. The way that they were doing that was to take the development rights from the air rights from the theaters and move that in a way where developers could develop housing in other parts of that district. So we achieved two things with this mechanism. One is the preservation of things that are important and meaningful to the city and to the local community, and the development that are development, real estate, housing development in particular, that's also a priority in the city. So I just wanted to put that out there. The reason why I'm bringing this up, and again, from a social equity perspective, is that they also, another example is West Chelsea. The High Line is being supported and preserved with funding that developers pay into to, in the case of Times Square, support the theater's maintenance and upkeep. Same thing with the High Line. The interesting thing about this and what we're doing in the community, in the local community, is saying, hey, how can we adapt this to the South Bronx? How can we adapt this to Harlem? How can we adapt this? Harlem could really use it. The churches are being snatched up it's like you see them today and they're gone tomorrow. It's a real issue. How can we bring these instruments to bear in a way that will promote equity in planning and justice for local communities, environmental justice for local communities? So they've been used in relatively affluent areas of the city. We're saying, hey, let's take this resource and bring it to bear upon communities such as Brownsville, similarly situated communities around the city. Vicky Bean and Voico put a really interesting article, The Effect of Community Gardens and Neighboring Property Values. Without going into it, this is a phenomenal piece of work. It's required reading for my students in my class at Pratt. But let's just say Vicky Bean connected a lot of dots. If you don't know the name Vicky Bean, she's she's ensconced in the Wagner School, Furman Center. She is really one of the preeminent experts in real estate policy. Before that, she was commissioner of the New York City Department of Housing, Preservation, and Development. And before that, she was back at NYU in the law school. Well, what they did here was to really identify, and I'll just go to the conclusion so you don't have to read the 50 pages yourself, but I highly recommend that you do. Community gardens over a 20-year span of time contributed something in the area, and it's in the hundreds of millions of dollars before you take out for costs, $500 million in tax revenues to the city over the course of 20 years, community gardens. And they did this, if you read this very closely, in some of the most robust returns to scale in terms of tax revenues happen in the most marginalized communities, in El Barrio, in Bed-Stuy, so forth and so on. She is suggesting for that kind of return to scale, we ought to think about TIF, tax incremental finance, right? Again, another instrument along with special purpose district zoning, along with transferable development rights, tax incremental finance. She suggested that for this kind of money, we really need to look at communities very closely and look how we can deploy this type of a resource that will redound to the benefit of the city and at the same time be meaningfully promoting the priorities around environmental justice and addressing the needs around food system equity and particular urban agriculture. So here, this is just a quick graphic out of a project that I'm doing at Pratt right now. More often than not, valuation of land in New York City and in other places is really reduced to a lot of times to really economically reductionist considerations of real estate value, real estate exchange value, right? What this project is looking to do, Nevin alluded to this earlier, when one quantifies, so this project is about quantifying what's happening in community gardens, quantifying, measuring what's happening in community farms, getting the data on how much food is being produced, yes, of course, but at the same time, how much carbon is being sequestered, how much particulate matter is being filtered, how much heat island effect is being mitigated as a result of the presence of trees, how much stormwater runoff is being mitigated as a result of permeable surfaces, as a result of raised beds. There's an individual back there, Mara Gittleman, who did some phenomenal research around community gardens contributions and benefits with respect to stormwater runoff mitigation, particularly where there's urban agriculture happening in raised beds, right? So, you know, this type of measuring will very much help the city to begin to green land use valuation, get away from just purely reductionist real estate valuation matrices. And then equal democratizing policymaking priorities, letting that inform it and inform a different way of approaching policy that embraces the real diversity of engagement and interests of the city. Okay, this is an example of what we're working on in the South Bronx. We are working on a community land trust initiative, and I must say, to the credit of the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, we are part of, that is when I say we, the New York City Community Garden Coalition, joined together with a community development corporation dedicated to developing affordable housing. That organization is known as We Stay, Nos Quedamos. We Stay derives from the fact that historically the community in the Melrose section of the Bronx was facing an urban renewal project. Anybody know about urban renewal? You've heard the term. James Baldwin called it Negro removal, right? So this community in the Melrose section of the South Bronx, Yolanda Garcia and others really organized to fight that kind of threat of removal and displacement, came up with an alternative plan, and that plan resulted in what we have today, something known as the Melrose Commons. We're trying to now build on that success in terms of community land trust development, whereby we're looking at how to take land out of the market. A community land trust is about removing land from speculation, decommodifying it, removing it from the market, and as such being able to preserve what is meaningful to the community. In this case, what we've done, the New York City Community Garden Coalition, along with Nos Quedamos, we put a proposal together that was accepted by Housing Preservation and Development, and we're in a really long and drawn-out consultative engagement with HPD. They accepted what we're doing, but HPD is an institution as such, a government institution, pretty conservative, meaning that they are not going to change overnight. But here, what this graphic identifies, the green are community garden spaces, the red are vacant land, and we said, hey, it's possible that we could approach this from a special eco district designation, sustainability district designation, that would allow the removal of development rights from places that are so important to the local community, in this case community gardens and community farms, transfer them in such a way where we can develop affordable housing. And because it's being done on land that's removed out of the market, there is something of a protection against housing prices inflating with the market, because the land is off of the market itself. Albeit that the building itself is an entity that will generate, finance, will have a cash flow character to it, but it will only be in such a way that is not going to, threaten people with being removed. Out of time, and I think that's it. Peace and Mother Earth's blessings. Thank you.
Just, yeah, hold the microphone.
Hi, everybody.
Oh, you might have to turn it on.
Hold on. Hello? Can you hear me anyway? Hello? Great. So I am Aziz Daykan. I'm the Executive Director of the New York City Community Garden Coalition. The New York City Community Garden Coalition came out of the ashes of Rudy Giuliani's policy of burning down neighborhoods throughout the city. It was intentional. We have historical evidence of having the fire department, New York City Fire Department, letting buildings burn down. And from that, people came in and took over their communities, took it away from Rudy Giuliani. And I always ask representatives who are working now, do you really want to be Rudy Giuliani again? I don't think so. So Rudy Giuliani, after he let these communities burn down, people came in and recaptured, and I think that's a really good way to say it, recaptured their neighborhoods. And they seed bombed, and they took what was left of the buildings and created community gardens. And one of the things that I've learned over the years is they're not just called gardens. They're called community gardens for a reason, because they bring people together. And I know there's a bunch of you in here who've heard this story like 16 million times, but it is one of my favorite stories. When we were organizing against HPD, 3 years ago, that they were trying to take away 34 community gardens from us, and we saved all but 11 of them. There was a man in that room who said, I've been living in my apartment for 25 years, and I think the person across the hall from me has lived there that long, but I don't know who that is. But I know my neighbors from my community garden. And I think that's a really important distinction of what these pieces of land are about. And this is about land tenure, this is about land justice, this is about food justice, social justice. It's the core of what we do in this city. De Blasio ran on a tale of two cities. And the tale of two cities was, turn around and the glass buildings behind you, and where we are right now, and where we are in the South Bronx. That's the tale of two cities, and it hasn't changed, and it never will change unless we actually want to make that change. And the change has to do with the false narrative of affordable housing versus open space, versus community gardens, versus farms. And so as we talk about this amongst ourselves, we have to recognize that language, whoops, came from Rudy Giuliani, basically. And it continues to this day. Ray alluded to Vicki Bean and her study, and it's a really important study. One of the things that I've always asked Vicki when she was in these meetings was, so you told us that community garden properties next to community gardens saw their property values go up. And And I always would ask her, you have the PhD, I'm just some guy who barely got through college. And so my question to you, and it was a sincere question, was when you take those gardens away, when you take that open space away, what happens to values then? Well, really the answer is the community gardens created these areas where developers wanted to come in. And one of the slides that Nevin showed really is you should go back, and it was the one in East Harlem. And look at the height of that building that they're going to put up. And that building is going to shade out just about anything that's going to be able to grow. And that's an issue. And so how do we need affordable housing. And I always tell everybody, the membership of the New York City Community Garden Coalition, probably every member is eligible, myself included, is eligible for affordable housing in the city. But how do you get that? And how does that happen while you maintain open space? And I think the other part of this is, and it worries me beyond anything, I think, beyond the affordable housing, is how do you get fresh food to people? How does that work? You know, we have community gardens that are in neighborhoods that have fresh food in places where there is none, and they're the suppliers of that. My family's from Iran, I often like to tell you that the word food desert is misappropriated. And it's misappropriated because my family's from Iran, and I've been to deserts. And actually, deserts bloom. Food deserts do not bloom. So I would urge you all to get out of here and get it out of your head and start calling it what it is, which is food apartheid. And that's really what it is. And nobody likes to hear that because that word is toxic. And it should be said that way because we have seen the absolute intentionality of not allowing food into these neighborhoods. So people in our community, in our world, try to find ways to make this city better and to find ways to create justice in this city. And part of this is also about the ability for people to live and breathe well. You go up to the South Bronx, and the rates of asthma and the rates of illness are just intensely higher than anywhere else. So the idea of having open space is really important to all of us. And how do we do that in a comprehensive plan? And when we first started this urban agriculture initiative with Raphael Espinal, the two words that weren't in the plan were community gardens. I was like, what? I mean, I was about to give testimony in favor of it, and I realized as I read it, and I learned this again. Ray teaches me a lot. I'm not a policy person, but I'm like 10 feet away from Ray on this one, but I'm learning. And so again, the words community garden are not in the lexicon of New York City, and that's the truth. And so when Espinal came up with this plan, it was like, where are we? There's over 600 community gardens in New York City, and many of them in your district, and you don't mention it. So it's an educational process for all of us to make sure that we talk to our politicians, because this is a political issue, and to Raphael Espinal's credit, he's actually says it now. He's actually come to community gardens. He's supporting the work that we're doing, but it's a long, hard slog sometimes to get through this and to make sure that the silos and the different agencies in this city work together to make this thing happen. And so what does it look like? What does urban agriculture look like? And I think it has so many different components to it. Again, it's about food justice, it's about land equity, and it's about letting neighborhoods decide what they want to do. And I think one of the great ideas that's coming out are these community land trusts and the transfer of air rights. And these are, when we talk to people about this, when we talk to people in power about this, you actually see heads nodding, which is really good. I mean, it's something that it's not a new idea, but it's a new idea in the communities that haven't had this before. It's a new idea for underserved communities, because listen to where they've been. They've been into the High Line, they've been to the Theater District, but where are they in our community? Where are they? And that's what we have to start doing, and I think any urban agriculture plan, as comprehensive as you want it to be, has to include all of those pieces that keep land intact. Because we're, again, ever since the Europeans came to this land and stole the land from the indigenous people, it's always been about power. Land is about power. Land is about the ability to make things happen. And folks, this is our land. And don't let anybody ever fool you that it's not. This is our land. We own this city. Its city would not work without all of us. So that's where we're at, I think, in terms of urban ag. We keep fighting. There's a lot of different initiatives. There's a lot of great people, my colleagues, people who are not in this room, people who are in this room. If you think you don't have power, think again. And I know I have like 2 seconds left. I just want to hit on one thing. The New York City Community Garden Coalition is doing this project called Gardens Rising. And that came out of Hurricane Sandy, and I marched with Sherry across the Brooklyn Bridge a couple of years ago to commemorate it. When Sandy hit New York City, especially on the Lower East Side, it flooded out. And when the waters receded, miracle by miracle, I realized that all the buildings next to community gardens had less damage to them because they're sponges and they absorb water. So through HUD, through the state, two different initiatives, the New York City Community Garden Coalition created this thing called Gardens Rising. It incorporates 47 community gardens on the Lower East Side to find ways to build green infrastructure to absorb as much water as possible, to create as much carbon mitigation as possible, and make the city a little bit better. And what we've learned is, and we're just starting the green infrastructure, we're going to do bioswales, we're taking away impervious surfaces and creating areas that absorb more water, pollinators. You can see it on the website. The point of that is, this is the way we work to make urban agriculture better and to make sustainability and resiliency in this city a reality. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Aziz.
I have exactly one slide that I'm going to share with you. Just so you can have a lovely visual that comes from one of the community gardens that we work with a lot. So thank you for that. I hate to come up here and then not really understand who is in this room today, so I want to ask just a couple of questions. And then I'm going to defer so much to Ray and Aziz, and my colleagues have come up and touched on so many different areas that I think are important, and just really, I've been like marking off things on my talking points that I don't need to cover. I want to touch on a couple of things that I think we can really emphasize. But I just want to know, one, how many people in here are actively growing food? Actively growing food. It can be a tomato plant in your backyard. Okay, we've got some farmers in the room. How many people are doing that as a full-time career? Are making the majority of their money off of that? Okay, keep your hands up, those folks who are doing that. How many of those folks would consider themselves making a living wage doing that? No other outside income. Keep your hands up. Okay. How many of those people work for a for-profit entity? Okay. I don't see any hands up. That is interesting. Interesting and indicative in some ways. But what I want to roll back and think about in that, one is just the community aspect that's so important when we're talking about this particular urban agriculture comprehensive plan. If we're talking about something that's comprehensive, it can't be comprehensive if we're not getting all of the people most impacted into the room, into these conversations. And I'm not saying that this room is the end-all be-all. It is, almost July. It's the middle of the day. It's a work day. There are tons of people who would love to be in this conversation, hopefully are live streaming it on their phones from a farm somewhere. I don't know. But it's really imperative upon us, the people who can get into these rooms, the people who can raise their hands and say, someone is actually paying for me to be here today, to inform this conversation, to be informed by this conversation. It's imperative on us to be able to bring the stories of those who cannot be into this conversation, in particular, farmers, farm workers. people who are working in terms of immigrant communities and bringing access to food in that way, people who are bringing that cultural diversity that urban farms are known for into our income streams. Those folks that are doing the infrastructure required to actually bring those foods into communities, right? So those people who are aggregators, those folks that are doing more cooperatives, that are doing food co-ops, things of those natures, those are folks that we need to have in these conversations. And I think one of the things that Ray had brought up in terms of the history of that task force, really important for us to think about, are really how are we building that out as part of our plan. Before these plans are even starting to be thought about, we need to think about how we're incorporating the voices of those who are one, most impacted, and the ones that are also disproportionately impacted by the disparities in health and wealth and wellness that we're talking about when we talk about urban ag, and all the wonderful metrics that it helps address. So those are the things that I really want to make sure that we're bringing into this space when we're opening up this conversation. I want to also bring into this space some of my own background, because I'm also like Aziz, a native New Yorker. And I also come from a long line of farmers from the American South, African American South. And one of the things that I think is really is a part of my own history, and actually until very recently, until I started to read, has anyone started to read Freedom Farmers by Dr. Monica White? Please write that down. If you have not started reading it, please do. Dr. Monica White, Freedom Farmers, I think it came out in 2017. And she's recently been on book tour in New York, and I got my signed copy right here. But one of the things she talked about was this idea that farming as an act of liberation and resistance, and not just about food provision and job creation. And I think that is critical when we're talking about who we're bringing to this conversation about urban agriculture. So I grew up with my mom is from Alabama, very rural Alabama. She went to college, a first year of college in Selma in the 1960s. And so I was waiting to hear these incredible stories about marches coming from my mom, coming from that background. And that wasn't her experience, actually. Her experience actually was working on her family's farm, being part of her family's farm through the 30s and 40s and 50s in Jim Crow South. And just that act of farming in those conditions under that systemic oppression and racism was an act of resistance. I didn't think about it that way. I was looking for marches. And I think that we need to reframe the way we talk about how people do resistance work in the city that is a critical part of urban agriculture. I get very concerned when we talk about economic development as a metric for urban ag. It's an important one. I really do think that. But it's also not the only one. That is critical because I think sometimes we discount the real services that these spaces are doing in our communities, and by discounting them, we undervalue their voice. And I think, as Aziz said, like these communities are our communities. We are not stakeholders within them. We are the owners of them. We are the stake owners of these communities. And I think we get it twisted because people constantly are calling us stakeholders. And to me, that means we're setting this table, right? We're having we want all of our stakeholders, and usually it's a corporation that says that, or some kind of government agency. You're a stakeholder. Thank you for giving me that title. I'm so appreciative. But actually, that's not what we are. We have the rights and the responsibilities of people who own space in our communities, that own these community networks that we have. And we need to actually exercise that. So when I think about the community plan and some of the, I'm not sure if Nevin's going to actually ask me the questions that I prepared, so I'm going to save some of that for our Q&A, and I really want to get into a conversation. But when I think about some of the ways that we're building out, looking at social equity within the system, thinking about the people who need to be brought to the table, I really want to emphasize this idea that we're not just consumers, that we need to be looked at as producers, as folks that have a real economic and cultural stake in the communities that we're serving. And that's imperative. I think that's often forgotten. As an educator, Farm School NYC, I love that you said, Nevin, that we're kind of like working with the young farmers of this world. And I want to say that farm school's definition of young farmers is from like 20 to 65, okay? Like, we're an adult education program for folks that want to learn sustainable agriculture in the city and want to do it through the lens of racial equity and social justice, and want to look at those models that really confront systems of oppression within our city. So one of the things that we're looking at when we're looking at that is just, see, now I'm going off notes, so I'm losing my train of thought. But, okay. I want to make sure that we're looking at the means of sustainability for these programs and the students that are coming through our programs. So one thing we haven't really talked about directly is labor and farm labor. And it's a really big concern, obviously, for a program that is committed to training the next generation of urban farmers. And I would say regional farmers, many of farm school students, after going through our 2-year certificate program in food justice and in technical sustainable farming practices, go on to found farms and work on farms in upstate New York, outside of this region, in different counties. So there's also this rural-urban connection. But across the board, farm labor is incredibly underpaid. In this city, farm labor is usually heavily subsidized by volunteer labor, and it's not often a sustainable career. And I think that that is something that an urban ag policy really needs to deal with. If we value the services that these spaces are bringing to our communities, we need to pay for them. And I look at some of the community gardens within our communities that are under-resourced. Often there's spaces that are available that have been, our elders have been holding them down for like years and years and years without a lot of support. Those are the places that we can invest in by bringing people who are trained by programs like Farm School NYC, that are trained by all different kinds of programs like that, really giving government support and NGO support to provide not just seasonal labor, but year-round, sustainable, benefit-laden labor to these spaces. And that's something that I really think that we should address in this, if we ever want these things to actually be sustainable. So I'm going to stop there, because I just want to sit around and talk with y'all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Our last.
All right, I'll start here. Well, first of all, thank you everyone for joining, and thank you especially Nevin and my colleagues. I'm actually glad that you all went first, because I think you did a great job of covering more specifically the topic at hand, suggestions for a comprehensive urban agriculture plan. I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach here. My, I'd say, area of expertise is a little bit more on the commercial urban agriculture space and the ag tech space. And what I found is there's a lot of varying perceptions as to what some of those terms mean. So I want to talk first about what those terms mean. I want to tell my story a little bit, because I think it's indicative of some of the folks that we've worked with, both in New York, but also around the world at the 2 companies that I've been at the last couple of years. And then I'll leave maybe some of the suggestions that I might have for a plan for the panel itself. So let's see. Oh, okay. I think we maybe missed a couple slides. That's all right. So I'll just tell my story quickly. My background is actually in the world of data analytics and digital marketing. I started my career with a high-growth tech company in sort of an elite strand, I would say, of the startup world. And after about 4 or 5 years there, I felt that I wasn't doing anything of purpose. And I think that's a theme that I've seen repeat itself now, having been here and working with a lot of other young professionals. And so I started doing research in the 2 subject areas I was really interested in, food and environment. And so when you do that, you eventually find urban agriculture. And I was living in Brazil at the time, doing a lot of research, and eventually I felt like I need to be back here in New York and really actually meeting people that I'm reading about and looking at these organizations. So I moved back here. I remember calling my boss and my boss's boss and telling them I'm leaving the company and I'm moving back to New York to get into urban farming. And they thought I was crazy. And again, I think it gets at, for me, coming from the world I came from, I knew nobody that was interested in these topics. To them, it was about, their definition of success was very much about economic development, salaries, and growth, and venture capital money raised. So that's sort of the perspective that I come to this world in. So I think a little bit different. And so, I moved back here. I spent about 6 months doing some consulting work on the side, and then just getting out there and trying to meet a lot of different people in the space and going to sort of every event that I could. And what I found was there were these sort of very different camps even within urban agriculture that to me had seemed like a very niche subject, right? And maybe sustainable agriculture at large. And eventually I sort of felt like my skills were a little bit more applicable to the commercial urban agriculture space and ag tech more broadly. And so after some research and finding sort of a mentor figure, eventually we launched a company called AgTechX about 2 years ago with a pop-up space in Bushwick, East Williamsburg, really as a place for other young professionals. I was finding, as I moved back here, I was not alone. There were hundreds of other young professionals from a sort of similar background that were really interested in more of a conscious capitalist approach. So how can I do good in the business world or do better versus what I'm doing currently? So we created a space where people could just come in, they could ask questions, they could take classes, they could learn, and they eventually could rent co-working desks as well. And we started working more and more with entrepreneurs that were renting those desks. And so, in doing that, what really surprised me was there were a lot of different approaches, a lot of different ways that folks were trying to have a positive impact through the lens of business. And again, what I was seeing was, though, there was these sort of tension points, or really these different communities that had or silos that had formed based on those approaches. And so one of the things that I started trying to explore was, well, what are the reasons, what are the rationales that people find themselves in maybe some of these different silos? And so we started trying to take a little bit more of a systemic approach, food system-wide lens to what was happening in this space. And so this is sort of a chart that I came up with just to try to map this out, and also to get at what really ultimately became my perspective with AgTechX, which is that, what you're seeing, and so just briefly what I've laid out here is not an exhaustive list at all, but some of the major environmental challenges as they pertain to the food system today, and potential solutions, which are sort of the columns. There's the maybe 3 different approaches within the sustainable or local agriculture movement. So you have urban controlled environment agriculture farms, so this is more commercial urban farming, looking at it an urban outdoor, maybe community-focused soil farm, and then a regenerative farm, maybe upstate New York State, and then just trying to map out which of these environmental challenges does each one really address. And I think you could debate maybe some of these check marks, but I think the overall point here is really that there's no one approach that's necessarily going to solve all of our environmental challenges. And so it's really through a combined approach. And what started exciting me was some of the startup and technology companies that were coming out trying to address specific environmental challenges. And I think where the commercial urban agriculture space or the ag tech space runs into challenges is when they're not honest about what challenge are you trying to solve. And so I think oftentimes you hear something like, this is, what we're doing today is going to feed the world. And realistically, they're growing, leafy greens and selling that to a couple of supermarkets in the surrounding area. That's not food security, right? So be honest about, well, what does your approach do? Maybe it's recirculating water, which can address the fact that currently over 70% of all of our fresh water goes to agriculture use and is generally used in a very inefficient way. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but again, just the sort of perspective that we were taking. And you can look at this through different ways. You can look at maybe socioeconomic challenges as they pertain to the food system. And again, similar, I think, conclusions can be drawn from that. And so what am I talking about when I talk about commercial urban agriculture? I think what people might think about is something like this. This is Aero Farms in Newark, New Jersey. So who's heard of Aero Farms before? Okay, so most of you, but Aero Farms is the largest indoor vertical farm in this region. So this is their newest facility. It's 70,000 square feet in an old factory building in Newark. They're growing mostly salad mix greens, and they sell mainly to supermarkets in the northern New Jersey area. And so that's one approach, though, of what we're finding. I think that's the approach that's getting a lot of attention, that's getting a lot of press, because it's getting a lot of the venture funding. What excites me is that we're seeing a lot of different approaches, and each of those approaches generally trying to address different challenges within the food system. And so, I wanted to map out just a couple. This is a slide I borrowed from a class that we teach, but just explaining that there's a lot of different approaches and a lot of different products that are coming out there. So just a couple to touch on here. We Are the New Farmers. They're actually one of 2 spirulina farmers that we know about in New York City right now. So they're growing spirulina as a microalgae that's highly, highly nutritious. And when you look at it in terms of the amount of protein on a per gram of protein basis, it is much, much, much less resource intensive, meaning the inputs required to get to that gram of protein are thousands of times more efficient than, say, growing cattle. And so this is really specifically to address some of those natural resource challenges that we have as a food system, across, looking at it from an entire food system standpoint. Smallhold is an interesting one. I think I saw that on Nevin's slide. So Smallhold is taking a different approach to commercial urban agriculture. With their model, they call it distributed farming. So they create these boxes, these controlled environment boxes, and they sell them to restaurants and retail stores. And then they go in just every couple of weeks and replace the substrate with new fruiting bags that fruit mushrooms. They train the employees on how to harvest those mushrooms. And so it's a really interesting approach to commercial urban agriculture, and also a new product. We're seeing this happen with crickets and in the edible insect world. I think Bee Downtown is a really interesting example of doing this sort of through the lens of education and leadership development. So they started in Durham. It was a college student that started at NC State. They've now expanded to Atlanta, where we've done some work. And they're working with large corporate campuses to put basically beehives on their campuses and create a leadership development model through actually training people to be beekeepers. So when you look at this, though, I think what you see is generally these companies are working with other retailers, corporate groups, organizations that have a lot of money. Why is that? I think it gets back to some of the points that Nevin addressed right now, which is we're at a point in the commercial urban agriculture world where there aren't really enough incentives or motivations in place for folks other than early adopters, which are generally groups that have money to take risks. We're not really at that point where we're able to see this in maybe a more diverse set of communities, and seeing these types of approaches being able to kind of reach the mass market. So we're not quite at that tipping point, but I think what's exciting is we've moved beyond just the point of looking at sort of one specific market, which has tended to be leafy greens or herbs in the commercial urban agriculture space, into new products and whole new business models, which is exciting. So that's really been that was our approach at AgTechX, was start with the problem, be honest with your solution. And then we just announced this last week, but we actually merged with a company called Agritecture Consulting. Agritecture started as a blog by the founder, Henry Gordon Smith, in 2011, really just to understand what was happening in this commercial urban agriculture space. By 2014, he was getting a ton of requests around data and business models and more insights, and so he created a consulting practice through that. So it's been around for about 5 years. And really what the consulting practice is trying to address is, I would say, a lack of data and maybe an excessive amount of hype out there about commercial urban agriculture. So this is just, we see this all the time of graphs or of charts that look like this, which is, the promise of urban agriculture, and it usually, I think, trying to maybe address too much and not really taking a data-intensive approach. And so, this is a beautiful looking chart. This looks very exciting. With just 50 acres, Boston could produce 1.5 million pounds of produce and create 223 total jobs. That sounds really exciting, right? Well, let's do the math. When you break that down, first of all, this has to be one hell of a productive farm. You're basically, you're netting $150,000 per acre in revenue, so that is a very, very efficient farm. Creating 223 jobs, when we look at an average pay of $20 an hour, meaning most likely everyone is making, or the majority of folks are making minimum wage, you're already at a loss just with labor costs, not including your capital costs, not including other operating costs at all. And so our perspective is that this actually hurts the industry. This hurts the potential growth because it gets people excited, and then when they look at the numbers and they look at the realities, and this especially happens in the development world, in the real estate world, you see a lot of amazing renderings, and when these groups then look at what it's going to take, the cost that it's going to take to incorporate these projects, they say, no way, this is not going to work. So our approach has really been, farming is risky and mistakes are costly, and so let's use data over hype to really help to expand the industry. So our services really focus on design and planning of urban agriculture, of large urban agriculture projects. And I'm out of time, so perfect. So that's my contact information if you're interested in just learning more. And then again, would love to maybe touch more specifically on some of the comprehensive plan measures on the panel.
So I'd like to invite everybody back up to continue the discussion. I have a few questions to ask the panelists, but then we'd like to open it up to everybody else. So thank you all again for really amazing presentations and a remarkable wide range and complementary set of comments. It's not always easy to have that happen with a panel that just comes together, but you touched on a lot of issues. I'd like to just begin by asking, maybe start with Ray. We've talked a lot about all the reasons for planning urban agriculture, but it can be a really technocratic process. And as you pointed out, lots of people don't understand how zoning works, how some of these initiatives work. How do we make it more democratic? And I'm going to ask this to Aziz as well. How do we ensure participation in a planning process and make sure that the agencies don't take a technocratic approach to urban agriculture?
That's a great question. I would say, there's something that I referred to in one of my slides, and that is to decentralize venues and times. Mm-hmm. That is to say, come out to local communities and first start with the community in terms of what are people's priorities, what are people's aspirations, starting there, and then backing into the planning from where people are at. In other words, this has to be a genuine and authentic interaction of meaningful communication. And meaningful communication cannot happen if it's just on the terms of one entity doing the communication or one entity setting the terms of communication. So it's very important. Like folks will say, "Oh man, I'm concerned about all the noise in the streets, or I'm concerned about all the traffic. I'm concerned about the fact that we have so many youth out of school." these types of things. And then, backing into that, I think that's what I would say. It just has to be a more genuinely respectful communication that starts with where the community is at.
Thank you. I want to ask that again to Aziz, but also focus a little bit more on two things. How do we engage everyone in the community? We've talked about social justice and the need to make sure that a planning process is equitable and just. And also, many community gardeners just want to grow some food. And how do we motivate people that this is an important process for people to be involved in?
So the Gardens Rising project that we've been doing is a community-based project. There's 47 community gardens involved in the project, and the way we set this up was to talk to the community gardeners themselves and what do you need. We did a feasibility study and we created some parameters, but within those parameters and listening to the gardeners, what do you want? What would be most beneficial to your community garden? What would be most beneficial to your block? And so, when we talk about community organizing, when we talk about participatory legislation and work in this field, I think that's the way to do it, is to make sure that the community is completely engaged, that their voices are heard. And by the way we set the project up, with the community involved in community engagement, people buy into the program and get excited by it. And I know, you're here, Barbara's here, and we hit bureaucratic snap-outs throughout the way. But we still know that people are interested, and we keep people engaged, and people keep coming to us, and we back to them. So it's a back and forth, and I think that's the way we have to do it in order to create an urban ag policy that's inclusive of everybody and just hear your voices. Tip O'Neill used to say all politics is local. I think it's even greater than that. It's block by block.
And I think that you mentioned Monica White's book and talked about the legacy of farming in this country. How do we ensure that a planning process, and planning has traditionally been used to exclude and dispossess people as much as include people? How do we make sure that if we engage on an urban agriculture planning process, we actually embody social justice in that process and achieve some just outcomes?
I loved I think Ray was bringing up the racial equity lens, the toolkit, I think they called it, out of Seattle. Now it's working. I think that was a really wonderful resource that they put together, and there's various renditions of things like that New York City can consider bringing into this process earlier rather than later, to really be making sure they're asking the right questions. But they need to have the right people answering those questions. So I think it all goes back to what we're talking about in terms of really making sure that the right people are on the table, engaging those folks. I have to say, as much as I am really pushing back against, I think when we're talking about looking at the root causes of the disparities that we're looking at, that's what we mean when we're saying that we're looking at social justice. We want to consider social justice. It's not just kind of like, what are the benefits that we're putting out there into the community? It's about not papering over the systemic issues that underlie the reasons why we're creating these all of these benefits to begin with, right? So usually that has to do with systems of oppression, it has to do with racism, it has to do with capitalism. And this is maybe where we're going to get a little further apart. But I think that it's incumbent upon us to have some critiques of capitalism and the ways that it works against our communities and has for generations. And that's a very important aspect to include, I think, in this lens that we're talking about, and include different groups that are really pushing back against the capitalist structure and looking at ways of solidarity economy, ways that we're sharing and providing resources to each other that don't have to do with that particular configuration of capitalism, or at least provides an alternative to sit alongside that. I think that's a really important part. And I also think that we are still operating within the system that exists now. And it's very difficult to ask people to come out to meetings, to different events, to listening sessions, uncompensated. We are constantly asking communities of color, Black and brown folks, myself included. I think NGOs are part and parcel of this, to come out, to take their labor, to extract their labor away from the projects they're already doing, to support these initiatives. And I think we need to, because we need to hear from folks, we also have to think about how we're compensating them. And that might be a stipend, that might be actually putting sweat equity into their projects, so we're showing up to their work days, we're showing up to the ways that they need us to. We're promising resources and we're delivering them. What does that look like? How is that reciprocal? That is respectful, not just asking people to kind of come and giving them, you know, some chips and soda.
Thank you very much. So I want to really touch on in more detail this question between about disparities in the urban agriculture system. Kristen Reynolds wrote a blog piece that is on our institute's website, and I urge you to read it. But we wrote a book together that talked about the disparities in the urban agriculture system in New York City, and one of the disparities in funding and excitement among elected officials and perceptions in the media is this disparity between the commercial sector and the traditional urban agriculture sector, the ground-based urban agriculture sector. How do we bridge that divide in developing a comprehensive urban agriculture plan to ensure that resources are more equitably distributed and attention is paid to all segments of the urban agriculture system? So I don't know, you started to talk about that, and you're maybe Ricky wanted to take a first stab, but I'd like all the panelists to maybe weigh in on this.
Yeah, again, I think it gets back to being honest about what you're trying to address. And so that, I think, will help to, right now, if you look at it, funding is generally coming from totally separate worlds. So most of the sort of startup activity, like the commercial urban agriculture sector, they're raising money generally from private investors that are looking for a financial return. So if they didn't invest in that farm, say, or that technology company, they would invest in another software technology company or another app or something like that. So it's more, or maybe they're an investor that would have invested into a more conventional farm, right, that's growing in ways that we know are really unsustainable, farms that are not paying their workers or not, there's no transparency in terms of how their growing methods, or are they paying their employees. So I think it's more of diverting money that's going one way towards another approach, an approach that is more transparent, an approach that where you are paying people more living wages, where you are conserving natural resources. Whereas I think with community urban agriculture, we should just be sure that, and I think commercial urban farms need to make sure that they're doing a good job of this, is not trying to infringe upon and not try to say, what we're doing is, this is food justice, or this is about food sovereignty, because it's not. It is trying to operate within the confines of the current system. Whereas I think what Onika is talking about is really, it's a more radical approach. And so I think we need to just be honest about those different approaches, and that, there should be a little bit of a line in terms of where some of those funding dollars are allocated, where they come from.
And thank you. Let me push a little further for the other panelists. Is there a way that we can use planning and policy to direct those private and public resources like green infrastructure dollars to communities of color, to projects that are led by Black and Latino farmers?
Well, yes. The short answer is yes. One of my ongoing overarching project approaches to this question is really looking at approaching this from two angles. One is we in the urban agriculture, the land-based traditional agriculture movement, we're just looking, I'm thinking of names such as Karen Washington, right, where we're just doing a ton of community organizing amongst ourselves to come together. Why do I say that? We have an example of us as a collective of growers in the South Bronx coming together as a collective, and really Karen Washington was the one that rallied us around a project to grow peppers, right? So as you know, one community garden is but a little piece of a patch of green. But when one, is talking about 30 community gardens, 30, we start to maybe approach something that might be an acre and then some, and where we've been aggregating the harvest from all of these community gardens and really growing peppers for something called Bronx Hot Sauce, which has been something of a runaway success. I am able to take some of that income and support what we're doing at Brook Park Youth Farm in terms of our Alternatives to Incarceration / workforce program. I'm actually able to pay out a stipend to young people who have been formerly incarcerated, who are formerly incarcerated and or currently running through the criminal justice system. And it's really kind of cool because folks are embracing as much an alternatives to desperation as a result of their backgrounds, maybe selling drugs, to an alternative that affirms their sense of being productive in a way that honors their sense of human dignity, selling peppers and earning something for it. What we have done based on that organizing, we are now taking that organizing and saying, hey, what else can we do as a collective of growers? So we recently put out and were successfully awarded a grant from the United States Department of Agriculture. That is, again, a collective of farmers in the Bronx, right? So we received just not too long ago a 4-year, $400,000 grant to build on the successes and get beyond Bronx Hot Sauce. The point being is that we're coming together as a collective and looking to each other and building from that. The other, so that's A. B is to really look at, when doing policy work vis-a-vis the city government, is to really look for win-wins. And that's what the Community Land Trust model is that I alluded to earlier. How do we, Nika, you talked about, and Ricky, I'm sure you're very cognizant of this, some of the very extractive and very destructive aspects of capitalism. But how can we humanize or let's say bring down the extractive commodification that's going on? How can we, for example, look at land, green valuing of land for its ecosystem services and our stewarding of these spaces while we're growing food, and that has value, and that has value to the local community, but it can have value to the city in terms of saving costs when it comes to having to engage in a decision around how the city is going to handle stormwater runoff mitigation. Is it going to invest in super capital intensive initiatives around gray infrastructure development, or can they invest in community gardens and really invest in the folks that are stewarding these green infrastructure types of resources? So, and again, how do we deploy planning tools such as special purpose district zoning and development, transfer of development rights? So I think that there are instruments there that we need to really remind the city that they have how the history of planning and zoning has impacted working class communities of color, and how it is incumbent upon the city to really look in a different way. So to develop a win-win formula. So working within ourselves, really consolidating ourselves as a community, and then also looking for those win-wins. And that means that really implies a lot of work.
I just want to add to that really quickly, and I don't know if you want to jump in on this as well. But I think that we need a diversity of approaches. I really do. We're operating within this capital structure we have as we're building alternatives to it. One thing that I'm really interested in, and I'm also working on as part of a collective of different Black-led organizations, is really looking at the ways that we finance Black and brown businesses within the farming space. So like, we're starting with New York State, and just the statistics alone, the latest ag census is really disheartening. So 15% of the population of New York State are Black. We make up 0.2% of the farmers in this state. 29% of folks identify as Latinx on some level. That also overlaps with Black and brown, you might know, and white. But they make up less than 1%. 1% of the farmers in the state. It is not growing either. This is a real issue in terms of the disparities, in terms of representation of the people growing our food. And when I'm talking about farmer owners, right, not workers. Obviously, the statistics look different there, but what we're talking about is power, right? The decision-making power that is enmeshed within our food system. That is a huge disparity that I think is very problematic. Obviously, as a person that is an educator to Black and brown growers primarily, this is an area of interest to us. And I think one of the biggest issues in terms of meeting that gap is not only actual training, like Farm School NYC does, but it's also access to resources. And I think this kind of like these two parallel tracks in terms of funding is problematic. We can't, Black and brown growers cannot depend primarily on foundation and private support in that way. These are charity models do not build power within our communities. So what are some other ways that we can do that? One of the things that you had mentioned in terms of kind of the collective organizing, I think is so dynamite. And what we're looking to is using models of community banking, community participatory budgeting, those types of things within our own communities where we're bringing investors from outside of our community and within. So accredited investors and non-accredited investors, folks that can actually bring in funds, even from the venture capital world, as a way of, I'm going to say reparations to Black and brown communities that have been, marginalized over generations. This is the thinking that we need to start going towards, where they're bringing those resources to these communities and then letting those communities actually decide how that is dispersed within those communities. So they're not kind of taking that power approach. And it's not necessarily a charity model because there is a return on it. These are actual financing models. But it shifts the way that the power in the decision-making is done, and it channels those resources back into where the disparities are greatest. So I think those are some things that we're talking about and building that can also get to getting us away from these kind of like two siloed approach to financing.
I think maybe it's about prioritizing, right? Like, I don't know if you guys saw the recent New Food Economy piece where they exposed the fact that the USDA had claimed that they sort of admitted, yes, we'd been discriminating with loans to Black farmers in particular, but we've since, I think, starting in the 90s, we've made good on that. And actually, the New Food Economy exposed that it was all complete BS. They hadn't done that. Some of the same practices have still existed for the last 20 plus years. And so I think if you think about it that way, the USDA prioritized white farmers and farmers that looked and operated a certain way for hundreds of years. And so it's now time to shift the balance more. I think a lot of this is on the USDA. And then the other point Ray made me think about, is the fact that I didn't want to say there should be a line where funding structures can't go to both community and commercial, but I think we need to define, the ecosystem services that you mentioned. The Green Infrastructure Grant Program is a great one. They can apply to both, right? There's commercial greenhouses that can capture rainwater and use that, and so it's a different approach than maybe sequestering it through soil, but you're doing the same thing. You're keeping it out of the sewage system, and so I think expanding the Green Infrastructure Grant Program and also taking the Green Infrastructure Grant Program and maybe using it through the lens of like urban heat island effect mitigation, that could also be something that could service both community and commercial. the other point I wanted to make, which is just funny, is in my group of friends, I'm the socialist. I'm like totally the anti-capitalist. And they, by the way, and they are Democrats still, which is hilarious. So I like being it's a new feeling being the capitalist on the panel.
And I just want to throw one last thing in that, and about capitalism, and just what everyone else is saying is that, we get boxed into the matrix of what is out there, and I think the way that we break out of that, the way we become socialists and beyond that, is to break out of the matrix and to not let that define who we are. I think once we do that, then we make capitalism maybe work for us, maybe not, but I think from my own perspective, that's how I start.
That's great. And so if there is an urban agriculture plan, we need to make sure that it is an out-of-the-matrix plan, and it's incumbent on all of us. So thank you very much. I'd like to open this up to you guys. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, we need a microphone.
This is a great presentation. I'm Enrica Sacca, and I'm from Plant Powered Metro New York, the Queens borough. And this is Carol. Carol's from the Manhattan borough. And I just want you to recognize that there is a paradigm shift happening in the medical world. They are realizing that there is science-based evidence that plants are healing. Eric Adams the Brooklyn Borough president turned his diabetes around. So we need you, we can build so much together if we can take food as medicine. We need the gardens. And I started my own in Astoria, and I need help out there. I have a sustainable garden, 1,000 gallons of rainwater, but I need help, and we need to work together.
I think that's a really good point. I think what we often forget is we seek our partners within our little sphere of worldly whatever it is, and I think we forget about different organizations. And I know the Community Garden Coalition has been trying to do that more and more, but we still have a small circle of friends, right? And so I think it's important to remember that. Thank you. Yeah, and be in touch. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Any other questions? Yes, in the back of the room.
Hi, I'm Sandra Jean-Louis. I'm from Public Health Solutions. Thank you so much for an amazing presentation. One thing that I would also say is missing in this conversation, and I think it's very important. It's actually a very important aspect of it. But I think I've been coming to these discussions for a long time, and one thing that has always frustrated me is the fact that there doesn't seem to be a lot of organization. There's a lot of us doing different work around New York City, around food equity and health equity and agriculture, but there is no coalescing of the work that we do together, to have a sustainable and lasting impact. And I want to throw this out to you out there. How do we do it? How do we make it happen? It's great to talk. It's great to have these conversations. But if we're not organizing, if we're not pulling ourselves together, it's not going to happen.
So you know what I'm going to say, right, Sandra? Sandra and I are in the same fellowship right now, Seeding Power Fellowship, and it just started, but that's part of what they're hoping that we will think through and achieve. It's a cross-directional approach, looking at all these different types of, and I love it. I'm going to mention Monica one more time, Dr. Monica White, because she talks about a liberation framework that goes across all of these different aspects. Like food is foundational, right? Like we can't have sovereignty without food, but we can say the same thing about healthcare. We can say the same thing about transportation. We have to say the same thing about financing. There are all these different aspects of what it takes for people to get free. And we need to have a movement that encompasses all of that. And it's hard work. And I'm going to pass it. I think Ray is burning for this.
One thing I would say in response when you said you made the observation, you just don't see coalescing happening. You have to get out. You have to run around. You got to get to Weeksville, where we're having discussions on reparations. You have to get with community development corporations, where we're talking about housing and community land trusts. You have to, get to as many policy meetings as you can. Talk with private equity. We're talking with private equity, impact investment people. We're organizing as a community of farmers. The organizing is happening. It's not front page news because it doesn't bleed, so it won't lead. I want you to know that there is a lot going on. A lot going on. It's more, maybe fewer folks are doing a lot, but there is a lot actually going on. The New York City Community Garden Coalition, we are all over the city organizing. So I'm just saying, look us up, NYCCGC. We're working with an environmental law firm, Earth Justice, on an outside of the box policy advocacy initiative that is being brought to bear upon environmental impact reviews here in the city. We're taking an advocacy approach via the state where we're working with Earth Justice, we're working with Pratt Institute, so we have an institutional, we have an advocacy approach. There is a lot going on. The field is such that we need to, what I just alluded to, is that type of intersectionality, which is very rich and diverse and very complex, but the issues are such, and it's commensurate to the issues that we're dealing with. So there is stuff going on. I mean, reach out to us at the coalition, reach out to me at Pratt, and let's get involved. And I see some familiar faces here as well.
Thanks. And just to follow up on your point about health sometimes not being explicit in these discussions, I think one of the challenges in a multi-dimensional field like food production is that issues like health are embodied in so many different dimensions of urban agriculture, from flooding protection to the urban heat island effect to food as medicine and food access. And so I think that one of the things that a planning process can do is to help sort of make explicit those benefits, to show the interconnections, and to enable everybody in the discussion to be able to speak to all of the benefits and costs of urban agriculture. One of the costs is, one of the concerns that people have expressed is the replication of conventional agriculture and commercial urban agriculture and labor issues. And so we need to begin to think about all of the benefits as well as the resource and social costs of different configurations of urban agriculture, and make sure that as we hopefully grow the system, that it's actually growing for social justice. Any other questions, comments?
Hi, how you doing? I'm Garrett Broad. I'm a faculty member at Fordham. Good to see some old friends and some new ones, I hope. My question is about the level of productivity that we want or expect or aspire to in terms of actual how much food is being grown in the city. So much of the benefits that we've been talking about this morning are really sort of around that, to not the actual production directly, but whether it's environmental benefits or cultural, community benefits, that sort of thing. So I'm wondering, how important is it to the folks on the panel that we're actually growing a lot of food in the city that's actually feeding people in the city? And is there any sort of specific percentage or general, idea of what we should be aspiring to in terms of how much food we're growing locally in the city?
That's a wonderful question. Speaking on about scale, I think it's something of a what I would say how I would respond to that is that we're not you're asking globally urban agriculture. I can say out of community farming and community gardens, we're looking to have an impact locally in our communities in terms of, Onika picked up on it earlier, in terms of solidarity economy, where we're using urban agriculture as a hub for food systems based economic development, a la solidarity economy development, a la circularity of economic development. We're literally working on that as we speak. That is to say, the production, the food processing, the actual hyperlocal distribution, the consumption and post-consumption, all have economic development potential. So that's the model that we're pushing. When you talk to someone such as myself, coming from the perspective and from the community-based perspective, we can have an impact. I know enough food is being grown to say feed something close to the entire population of homeless folks. You know, if you looked at that, the number of homeless folks and the amount of pounds being, again, locally incarcerated folks, enough food to, you know, get some food out that way. If we look at those types of collaborations and calibrations, actually, so, you know, there is really a priority, and I'm looking to my sister here, you know, around how do we address historic marginalization, of which food is an integral part, and how do we begin to use it as a vehicle for sustainable development within our community. So we haven't exhausted that. What we're talking about, I'm in conversations with WEDCO, right? Women's Housing and Economic Development Corporation, because of Intervale Green, and saying, hey, how can we replicate, you know, what's going on there otherwise? How can we begin to iterate, you know, greater production capacity, but also iterate the local economy around that? What we're also doing is literally, in so doing that, we are also planting seeds around what would constitute a healthy community in terms of redefining what it means to be a consumer of food, you know, and that is a ripple effect out from what we're doing. Part of our greatest strength is our visibility, and we're just looking to build on that strength and that potential.
Thanks. We have time for one more quick question, and you have the microphone. Thanks.
Well, good morning. My name is Carlene Denal. I'm a public school teacher in Brooklyn and a community chef. So my students are the demographics. There's newcomers to the country, all over the different kinds of different countries in Africa, South America, the Middle East, and even Europe and the Caribbean. So this last semester, we collaborated with City Harvest, and I taught a class on food, health, and nutrition, and food justice. And I think my question is directed to Ricky. So in your milieu, or anyone who can answer, no one in particular, but in your milieu, how do your group of elite and educated people incorporate or provide access to Black and brown people who are not as savvy? How do they learn more or become a part of your
I mean, for me, I look to organizations that are already doing this. So Teens for Food Justice is one, and I should have mentioned them in my slide too, of different approaches. They are building commercial urban farms in schools. They're in, I think, 3 or 4 schools right now. So they're producing enough greens and vegetables to feed that entire school population, and the students do most of the production. So they have an actual farm manager, a couple farm managers, and so it's a really innovative program. And then on a smaller scale, you have New York Sunworks that does sort of smaller scale, maybe a small greenhouse or a couple of hydroponic or aquaponic systems, and they have integrated curriculum at each grade level. Those are 2 great programs, but there's a ton around the city that are doing this, working in schools. I think it's like one of the most exciting things about the urban agriculture movement at large is getting into schools and getting into kids, or getting into people at younger ages.
That's an important point, not just in terms of where you're going with it. Community gardeners are aging out, right? They're graying out. So we have to, it's imperative on us to educate youth and to have them understand where food comes from and how you make food, right? Not just grow it, but how do you eat it? Yeah. And I think many community gardens throughout the city work with public schools to make that happen. But it's a really important point. The Community Coalition has programs like that, but we don't have enough. And it's an issue of money and being able to support those programs. But yeah, it's really, I love your question because it's something that we always think about. So we grow. Then what? Right?
With that, thank you to the panelists, and thank you to those of you who are in the audience, and we'll continue this discussion further. If you haven't signed in, please sign up, and you can get our newsletter, and we would like to continue this discussion onward. Thanks so much. This is great.